Across this quiet land, stories from the hearts of Canada. Empathy in motion. The Augy Jones story. Our guest is Augie Jones, educator, advocate, and principal, Nova Scotia Community College, and has had many more roles. I'm your host, Gerard Damon. From the basketball courts of Halifax to the classrooms of Nova Scotia, Augie Jones has been building bridges through empathy, education, and courage. In this episode, we explore what it means to teach from the heart and to lead with purpose. Augie reflects on his journey as an athlete, educator, and advocate for equity, showing how empathy is not only an emotion, but a practice in motion. Augie, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Gerard. I appreciate it.
Now, you grew up in a household where activism and education walked hand in hand. How did your parents, Rocky and Joan Jones, shape your early understanding of justice and belonging?
Well, it's a nice segue into the empathy piece because I think, growing up in a household where fairness and equity was always metaphorically on the table, right? So, there's a misconception that Rocky Jones, who was a civil rights lawyer, and my mom, who also worked in the law industry and was about equity, people would sometimes believe it was only for African Nova Scotians or Black
Hmm.
people, people of African descent. But in fact, the people that came to visit our house and talk and eat and have drinks and socialize and pontificate was a whole group of people. It was Indigenous folk. It was, and people that were incarcerated. It was people that were living in poverty. It was politicians. It was people that were affluent. There was such a mix of people is that from a very young age, and you remember that was like late 70s, early 80s, we were supposed to be seen and not heard as kids. And so nowadays I find young people are right in the conversation, but we couldn't do that back then. So I was very much a watcher, as you alluded to, Jared, a watcher. And I was watching conversations and I was watching what it meant to hear the reasoning behind being fair and being equity and making sure things are balanced. And I also learned that you can get in and out of conversations and you don't always have to agree. And if things get heated, you don't have to fear that. Right. And for me, that's like 50 plus years ago. I learned that. And that's been very helpful for me in my adult life, where if you get into crunchy conversations or you get into deep conversations, everyone has a perspective they're coming from. So the passion, you don't need to fear the passion. You don't need to fear the anger as long as people aren't coming to fisticuffs. I think that I learned from very early on that, that sense of getting to know other people is through conversation. It's through listening. It's through empathy. Can you walk in their moccasins? Right. And so for someone that's been to jail, hearing them talk about that and what it means to be incarcerated and come up with that label and finding it very hard to find a job. So because of that, you end up going back to crime because that's how you made money in the first place and it got you in jail. And so the word recidivism of people returning to jail, like I heard those stories. And so my dad, just to give it a concrete piece to this question, had a government program that he created called ROPE, Real Opportunities for Prison Employment. And so the government, through dad facilitating this program, would pay 50% of the salary of someone who was incarcerated and was out of jail. And all the corporation or business had to do was pay 50%, like as an incentive. And so it was an incentive to make sure that these guys got work in factories and furniture stores and just small level, but it was something that at least money was coming in for them. And that was a big buffer stopping them from getting back into a life of crime. And so these are things that I saw and witnessed from a very young age.
That's interesting. And we probably need that ability to have those crunchy conversations more so now and respectfully and being able to
Yeah.
agree to disagree and value each other more so today than ever. Now, the name Agasu carries deep meaning. What does it represent for you today? And how does it shape the way you move through the world?
Well, I was born in 1968 and it was a time, of the civil rights movement in the US. And so we had 5 children in the family. I have 2 older sisters, Casey and Tracy. And there was a point where Stokely Carmichael, who was in the Black Panther Party and became Kwame Ture, he was married to Mary McKeeba. And in the late 60s, they had been at a conference in Montreal with my parents. And my dad and mom said, "Hey, why don't you come to Halifax to get away from the storm?" And so we're talking FBI storm, all of that. They end up coming, and when Mayor McKeeba met me and was talking to my father, she's like, you've got boys, and they should have African names. And so my name is Augusto, which means Black Panther. 1968. I have a brother named Patrice Lumumba, but we just call him Patrick or Patty, after Patrice Lumumba, who was the first president of the Congo. My other brother's name is Shaka, after Shaka Zulu, of a legend out of the South African region. So Augusto, for me, it's interesting. People call me Augie, right? And that's my name. People know me through basketball as Augie. But the only person that called me Augusto was my mom. Like, Augusto, that meant I was in trouble. But the name resonates, I think. If you Google it, it has some connections to West African deities, and not only Black Panther, but which is a loose interpretation of it. It's more so refers to the leopard people and the leopard king of West Africa. And it also has in Haitian deity, also has resonates as well as the leopard king. So in all of that, it's a very Afrocentric name.
That's interesting. When did you first sense that basketball could be more than a game, that could be a language of connection, discipline, and self-expression?
Yeah, I think, I started when I was 6 years old, and my first season in mini basketball, I scored one basket. Wasn't very good, but I enjoyed the team stuff. And as I got into what we've all kind of linked with sports, was having friends and being on a team and going to practice and traveling to games, and all of that was attractive to me. I think that to link the empathize others pieces from about 12, 13, I discovered the point guard position because when you're 10 years old, it's the person that can do the most right-hand layups that is like MVP of the league, right? And so as I progressed into the game and people got better, there was a part around the intellectual part of being a point guard and getting the ball to people and different passes that you can throw at different times. And that whole empathizing piece, which is how do I get big men the ball? How do I get shooters the ball? How do I get my wing the ball out on transition? Because he's not a great shooter in the half court, but if I can get him a head man, he can beat people off the dribble before the defense gets back. So, from about the age 13 and into the rest of my high school, college, and national team career, that point guard position was where I became most passionate. And it was about distributing, making people comfortable. And that wasn't only with passing and running plays, it also was with how I talk to people. And if I threw a pass and it bounced off your hand, I'd just say, my bad. That's me. I should have threw it, because that person that was going to dwell on it, I'll just take responsibility, even though I know it was a perfect pass. I would just say, that's me, so that they could get on and play and I can just park it and do my thing. And so I think as I progressed into basketball, that was the place where I knew I could carve my niche, is as a point guard. As we know, the point guards are a dinosaur at this point. I mean, I think it's more of the scoring point guard and Steph Curry and Kyrie Irving. And there's so many point guards that score. I think Shea Gilgeous-Alexander would be a tall point guard in today's era. But I'm back in the day of Mo Cheeks, Jason Kidd, Bob Cousy, those setup point guards. And I think
John
the only
Stockton.
one left that does that is John Stockton, my guy. And so, it was at that point, I really bought into that position. And that was where my passion was.
Now, how did your time at St. Francis Xavier University shape your leadership style and your voice as an educator?
Well, what's funny is, and I think this is part of stereotyping, is as I got to high school and got better at basketball, people knew me for basketball. But at the time, I was president of student council of my junior high and high school. I was on the honor roll. I was in the debating club. I was in the drama club, chess club. I wrote poetry. So I considered myself an academic nerd, and I'm saying that in the most positive way. And then, but that always people say, oh, that's Augie, he's a baller. That's Augie, he's a baller. So when I went to St. Francis Xavier, Steve Konchowski, who's a legendary Canadian coach, had already recruited my best friend, Wade Smith. And Wade is a year ahead of me. We went to Queen Elizabeth High School in Halifax. And so Wade's first year, Konchowski was kind of seeing that I was connected to Wade and he knew I was okay basketball player, but he wasn't too high on me. But I did come up on a campus visit and I stayed in Wade's dorm room and we went to scrimmage and I balled out a bit. I think I turned Konchowski's head around. Oh, I think this guy is recruitable. But for me, I was also going to university for academics. And so I do think that my journey into education was interesting because my undergraduate degree is in poetry. So I did a undergraduate thesis on George Eliot Clark. I studied his early anthology, Saltwater Blues, and I studied that and did my undergraduate thesis on that. So my first degree is in poetry. And I was wanting to be a broadcast journalist. So in my fourth and fifth year in the summers, I worked for CBC Television in Halifax on Bell Road. And I was like an intern. And so while I was doing that, I applied to Ryerson, Toronto Metro, but Ryerson at the time, and got in for my fifth year to go and do broadcast journalism. And we lost to Concordia in the quarterfinals of the Nationals my fourth year. And so I said to my mom, Mom, I got to go back. I need to go back. And I'd already gotten an undergrad. And my mother said to me, you're not going back to drink and party. So unless you can find a 1-year degree, you're not going back to St. FX. So I literally flipped through the course book, found Bachelor of Education 1 year. Boom, Mom, I'll do that. I deferred my acceptance into Ryerson, Toronto Metro, for a year, and I just did a BED as a throw off. Once I got into like 3 weeks into September, Jared, I realized teaching was my calling. Like I really did think that teachers just said, turn to page 56. I did. I didn't know there was a pedagogy behind it, that there was a way that you could move and use the blackboard and set up the seats and use curriculum as a way to empower students. And so the more and more I got into the background side of teaching and the tools of teaching, or what we call the pedagogy, I was more excited about that. And also, I'd always worked with youth. So even if it wasn't basketball camps, I was doing rec camps, youth camps. So I combined my love for basketball, my love for English language arts, and my love for youth. And I graduated in 1 year with a Bachelor of Education in English language arts. And so I started what would turn out to be a 20 plus year career as a high school English teacher.
That's excellent. So you kind of fell into your lap, and it sounds with your background, that you had some skills that would definitely be suited to do that job. Now, looking back, who was the first person to truly see you, not just as a player or a student, but as a whole person?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit timely because we're now in November of 2025, and a couple of days ago, Bev Greenlaw got inducted into the Nova Scotia Sports Hall of Fame. He was my coach when I was 14 years old, community YMCA, Anthem basketball. And I think the whole person would link to what I already said about being a point guard is he knew I was trying to think the game. And I do think that coaches coach their position. So I think coaches who are played in the post are better coaching post players. Makes sense. Coaches who are shooters are better coaching shooters or building a system around shooters. Our St. FX system was around shooters. Steve Konchowski still holds the record for most points in a championship game, something like 40 points, where he came from New York City. He's a shooter. And our system was built around that. Well, Bev Greenlaw was a point guard. So at 14 years old, I think that there was a connection between him being my coach, him being someone like he would drive me home after games, or we'd have a group of guys, he dropped them off, or even in the car, we were dissecting the game. Some of the players at 14 didn't want to hear that, but I was totally immersed in dissecting the game. And so I would say Bev Greenlaw, who went on to coach Dalhousie, he coached at University of King's College, he coached Acadia Women, coached provincial teams. He's still a friend of mine to this day, but I would say at 14 years old, he would be one example of someone who saw my full potential and spoke to me around how I could get to that full potential.
That's interesting. I did see the post, and that's great accolades for a contributor in the community for sure, Coach Bev Greenlaw.
Yes.
Now, so from the court to the classroom, your journey from athlete to educator feels almost seamless, as if both worlds were preparing you for one another. Now, what similarities do you notice between the basketball court and the classroom?
Yeah, there were many, and even your question makes me reflect on that because there's a flow to the conversation in that, from being a intellectual basketball player, also to being that academic nerd guy that people really didn't, some people knew me as that, but the majority of people didn't know that I had this other kind of part of me that was an academic, high level academic part. I think that, I always refer to myself even now as a point guard. When I've had high level government jobs, and when I was in the classroom, it wasn't about me. It was about how many shots, metaphorical shots, open shots I could get youth that were in my classroom. So I very much had a team mentality and a point guard mentality, which I brought in the classroom. But I also had a mentality of I knew what elements of success I used in order to become a good student. So part of that is you have to study. That may seem obvious, but we know that there's a lot of guys around the basketball world that never even knew that cracking a book was going to help them get better grades. And what I knew and learned was people would connect their grade to their cognitive ability. And you got a 30% because you didn't hand in assignments. You didn't get a 30% because you're not smart. And so I really used that type of empowerment talk in my English classroom to make sure that the team moved forward. So I was always blending, as you said in the question, my experiences in team basketball and my experiences in the classroom. And I brought that to the English classroom. And I can give you an example. For grade 7, we're doing Romeo and Juliet, and I'm a big fan of all literature, but definitely Shakespeare is one of them, just in the immaculate storytelling. And so I wouldn't get people to read Shakespearean language. That wasn't so much. I needed them to get into the story. So we're doing Romeo and Juliet, and there's one or two kids put their hand up and go, "Man, Mr. Jones, we hate Shakespeare." And I say, "Yeah, but you never got taught by Mr. Jones yet." And so my first opening question was, and these are junior high kids, they're 15, 14. I said, "Have you guys ever really liked someone or dated them and the parents didn't like you?" And they started answering that question, and I knew I had them hooked. And I said, "Okay." And so now I'm going to introduce you to the Capulets and the Montagues. And from that point, they didn't see Shakespeare as distant from them because it was a different language and it was centuries ago. They actually saw the commonality in that Romeo and Juliet's fictional journey, how tragic it was definitely parts of it that they could relate to. So that became my tool in teaching English, whether it was poetry or writing, 5-paragraph essay or a short story. I very much took it from a point guard, organized, that English is something, being able to read and write is universal to everyone. So oftentimes kids don't like English because they've had bad English teachers that make them seem like English is some complex thing. It's not complex. And so as I broke it down like that, I think that, my experience as an athlete and a high level athlete and my experience in academics definitely blended to make me what I would consider an effective English language arts teacher.
So you're saying that coaching definitely influenced your philosophy for teaching and being an effective educator. Now, which lessons from sport, such as discipline, teamwork, and success and failure, translate most naturally into education and leadership?
I think hard work and discipline, I think that there's a disconnect where, any human being that thinks that they can get something without working for it, that's a hard go. Like, I don't, I think there are people that sometimes life falls in their lap. And if you're a trust fund baby or, things happen like that, I get it. But for the majority of the human beings on earth, you get in shape by going to the gym. You get a larger savings account by putting money in it. You move up in companies because you just do good work day after day after year. Next thing you know, you move from the bottom of the company. Now you're an upper level executive. It comes from hard work. So we'll go back to the beginning of the interview. My first year in basketball, I scored 1 basket, 2 points the whole season. And so how did I go from there to playing for the Canadian under-19 team? Hard work. Hard work. It's talent is part of it, but God gives talent to everybody. Everyone has talent in something. But I think that the difference between if you want to keep growing, you have to put work into it. So one of my formulas in the classroom was to say to students that your mark is based on how much work you do. So one of the main things I would say is if you don't hand in assignments, and it's surprising how many students didn't understand this. They honestly thought that the teacher doesn't like me. That's why I got the 40%. I was like, I'm going to debunk that myth right away. It's hard work. So when assignments are due, when you don't do that assignment, you're losing points. And I would bring out the red, because we didn't have technology. This is like 90s. We just kind of had the red school book. And I would show them, like, here's where you didn't hand something in. That's a zero. Not because you're not smart. It's because you didn't hand it in. And so if you're handing in assignments, if you're studying for exams, actually going over the work, if you're taking good notes, these are all the same fundamentals of if you want a left-hand layup, you need to work on your left-hand layup. Like when no one's around, you can't just, because then all of a sudden, as you get up in basketball, as you would know, Jared, is they start to say, force him left because you got no left hand. Now you were killing people in grade 7, 8, and 9 with the right hand. But now that you're in grade 11, 12, you need a left. But if you never worked on the left, you don't get it. And so I think that discipline and hard work is that kind of, sometimes I call it spiritual logic, right? Like it just makes sense that that's the key to growth. So spiritual logic works on the basketball court, and it also works in your job. It also works at work. It also works with your relationships. So when you have a significant other, there's an amount of work to be done. You have work, you just don't sit back and play PlayStation and Xbox and chill. No, you have a relationship, you need to work at it. So there's a part of that I think that became a philosophy for me that I could pass on to not only students, but also on to young basketball players.
Now, was there a key moment on the court that shifted how you perceive empathy or leadership?
Yeah, I did because I became a part of many championship teams. And so, at Queen Elizabeth, we won two provincial championships in a row. And we had a very good team at St. FX. Probably didn't win a whole lot of championships, but we did win the 1986 Canada Games gold medal in Cape Breton. And I was a point guard on that team, and I was also a part of Steve Konchowski's back-to-back U Sports CIAU championship teams of 2000, 2001, 2002, in that period. I coached that St. men's team with Ross Quackenbush. We won AUS championships. So I guess what I learned, as I was coming into being a point guard is if I can set a tone and do my piece of how we practice, how we show up to games, how the pregame warm-up goes, how we deal timeouts when we're down 15, how we take losses, how we take wins, all of those things I started to go, wow, this works. And it worked with different teams. So as long as I came, and let's just sum it up to energized people, then that was a huge part in a championship season. And so I did that not only on the basketball court as a point guard, but I eventually got into coaching. I eventually got obviously into teaching. And then in the recent decade, I've had high-level executive jobs where energizing and empowering the team was a formula that works.
Tried and true, definitely. So when you started teaching English, how did storytelling and sport connect in your classroom practice?
Well, storytelling, and this is why, man, I said it in the last question around me being a teacher it's interesting how students will get disconnected from storytelling. Every human loves stories. That's why we watch Netflix and movies, and someone comes in and says, you know what happened? And then all of a sudden we're paying attention. Why? We love the story. And thinking that English language arts is way harder, like it's not math, right? But yet there's some teachers that will present English and literature and grammar as high level difficult. It's not that. And so I think that storytelling, if you know the word griot, every culture had a griot. So pre-writing things down, it was storytellers that were your historians. And if someone passed away in an indigenous community, in a South Asian community, an African community, in a Middle Eastern community, in an Asian community, there was usually an elder that held the stories. Because really the Bible is stories. The Bhagavad Gita is stories. The Tao Te Ching is stories. All of these, what do we call spiritual books, are just stories. So stories are central to the human experience. And so storytelling for me as a English teacher was, how do you tell stories? And I can give you an example. I had a unit on short stories. And I said, okay, what I want you to do is we're going to start out, and everyone can do this, is what was the best day of your life or what was the worst day of your life? And boom, I got them. Again, got them hooked. And then I say, now I want you to, in point form, to write down what happened that day. Just write it in point form, bullets. I woke up and then this happened and this happened, whether it's the best or the worst. And say, good. Okay. I said, now I'm going to show you a storyline. So your storyline goes from introduction to introducing characters to the rising tension, or what we call the denouement. And then you come down to the climax, and then the story kind of dissipates a bit, and then you have your ending. And so I already had them with the idea, and then they had the details, and then I gave them the structure. And so then as they started to write it, I said, so now take your best day, worst day, and start from the bullet points. Start writing from the beginning of that day and write it from your perspective. And so 85, 90% of the students wrote a full short story that they were proud of. They weren't intimidated. They didn't worry about it. And I also say to them, don't worry about the grammar and spelling. That's how you get writer's block, is you're trying to fix things before they're done. Just throw up on the page, get it down, and we can clean it up later. Cleaning it up is a different thing, but let's get the idea down. So most kids got that down. And I will tell you that I'm sitting in my home office and I'm looking at, I've got a garden shed and a wood shed outside, and I've got a gazebo and different work. And that was done by one of my grade 10 students who's a grown man now. And he wrote me a short story under that same unit. And it was about him getting shot in the hood. And it was an outstanding story. And he never even knew he could write that story, but he wrote the story. And it was, I remember the story to this day. And he handed it to me and I read it and got it back to him the next day. I said, whoa. I said, Jonathan, this is very good. And so I think it's that where everyone can tell a story. And the other example in my Empathize Others, I do a lot of workshops and professional development facilitation. And you'll be surprised, even introverted people want to tell their story. So if I'm working with teachers, the first thing I'll start them off with as an icebreaker is, how did you get into teaching? And every single person has a story, whether they're introverted, extroverted. If you give them the time and space to tell their story, everyone loves telling their story. And oppositely, everyone loves listening to stories.
It's like a human condition. We're conditioned for that. The whole oral teaching piece, sitting at the, kneeling at your grandparents or parents or uncles or aunts and listening to stories. It's a beautiful thing. That's excellent. I like how you've implemented that. Now, let's move to empathy and equity in education. You've spent decades helping schools understand inclusion, not as a program, but as a posture. What motivated you to start Empathize Others?
In the early teens, for about a decade or so, I'm working in education, and everyone's, they're asking me, from what you've heard, some of my approaches in the English classroom, can you pass that on to other teachers? So I was doing it, and I was doing it for free, doing it for free, doing it for free. And then at a certain point, I would sit down and hear people who were consultants, people that were getting paid and flown in, and they were paid to do their thing and put up at a hotel. And I'm listening to them, and I'm going, I'm better than that. So, and not in an egotistical way, it's almost an empowerment thing to say, I can do this. And so around 2018, I started to think about Empathize Others, and I thought it was I wasn't great at math, but some of the simple parts of math I did like. And one of the best elements of math I liked was a common denominator. You break it down to this is the common denominator. Like, you can't break it down any more than this. And so I find Empathize Others is a common denominator, because as much as I want people to understand my life as an African Nova Scotian, someone of African ancestry in a majority white country, I need to empathize with the LGBTQ plus community as a heterosexual. I need to empathize the indigenous community as a settler. I need to empathize women as a man. I need to empathize people who have disabilities as someone who's able-bodied. And so it's very interesting how marginalized folks will plead their case. So someone's saying, you got to honor me as a Black person, but yet that male beats his wife, right? You know what I mean? Or you have to honor me as someone who has disabilities, yet you're homophobic, right? So the Empathize Others is almost like a 360 concept that we all have work to do. No one's in a space where you can lay back and say you know everything and you don't have to empathize anymore. And what this also opens it up to is empathy is a listening vibe. It's a listening verb. It's not a talking verb. It's a listening verb to empathize. And then behind that is action. So when you listen, there's a call to action. Are you going to do that or not? So Empathize Others became how I frame things, because as being Rocky and Jones' son, I know there were people that as soon as I walked in, they expect, oh, here comes junior civil rights, that type of thing. And I would blow them away, because I was owning my own privileges. I was talking as we're all in it together and we all have work to do, and making connections that, yes, I'm a person of African ancestry. And when you're in a minority situation, it's a tough go. I also lived in the Caribbean. So I lived in Jamaica, Guyana, St. Lucia, Bahamas. In those places, it was a majority Black country. It's a different environment. But when we talk about, in Canada, if the darker your skin is, the tougher it is for you. Whether people believe that or not, it's the truth. Also in Canada, the more of a physical disability you have, the tougher it is for you. Also in Canada, if you're from Indigenous heritage and the deeper that you are to living on a res or being someone that's connected wholly to the culture, the more difficult it is for you. It's interesting. People may deny that, but they don't live that life. So feel it, know it, right? Empathize Others has the logo or the saying, feel it, know it. And so I then started to do workshops with Canada Revenue and businesses downtown Halifax and schools and teams around this concept of empathizing others and what does it mean for you to come outside yourself. And again, that's point guardness, right? Are you okay with getting other people the ball, right? Or do you just want to hog the ball and shoot it all the time? And so that's where I started Empathize Others consulting services in 2018.
Now, so you've kind of defined empathy, but how does it differ from sympathy or performative allyship?
Depth. Like marginalized people can sniff out inauthentic behavior quickly. And at this point, after decades and decades, so, if there's a woman who's talking and embedded in strong women's rights, the way that you hold a door for her, she's going to challenge that. Like, and men have to get into that. Like, I remember one guy said, "Oh, the mistletoe thing, taking it too far." Like, no, you're not allowed to just randomly kiss people at Christmas under the mistletoe. Dude, that you could do it in 1975 doesn't make it right. And so I think that the really when we came out of the George Floyd Me Too movement, Indigenous Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ plus empowerment movements, you now had to decide what type of ally and because sympathy is it's like being in the shallow end, and performative. I will tell people that marginalized communities use the word performative behind your back a lot. The government, oh, that's performative. Whatever program they're putting in, which means it's not sustainable. It lacks funding. It doesn't have a future vision. We think about the Indigenous saying 7 generations. Are you building something that lasts 7 generations? And if you're not, then it lands under sympathy and performative allyship and being shallow. And so in the year 2025, and I would say that it's the age of empowerment. People who have disabilities feel empowered. People who are immigrants and coming to another country, people who are in the gay, trans, queer community, it's no longer that those people were feeling shy as marginalized people. So as people feel more empowered, you're really being challenged to be authentic. And also being authentic means that you're going to make mistakes. I'm going to use the wrong pronoun. I'm going to say something to an Indigenous person. For example, I was principal at NSCC and we were building campus housing in the back. Someone called it a residence. And our Indigenous advisor, Denise, said, "Can you please stop using the word residence, like residential schools?" So you may say, "Oh, that's small." No, but who are we to tell someone that triggers too small, right? So we had to work on it to keep saying campus housing. We're building, and we did that for a year and a half because obviously the building was taking a while to get put up. But in any meeting, anytime we talked about it, we didn't call it residence. We called it campus housing. And so are you going to step in doggy do? Yes. But who are you to go through life and not want to step in doggy do? Right? Like you're going to. And then if you're humble, you can say to the person, "You know what? My bad. I'll recheck my thinking, but that just came from," even with the N word and things like that. Like it depends what space it's coming from because everyone's going to step in doggy do. And so when you do it in an age of empowerment, do it with humility, do it under a guise of changing and improving and apologize. Done. You don't need to feel guilty about it. Because we're all going to be stepping in that because in an age of empowerment, the boundaries are way different than they were before, where you're going to say something to someone and they feel like, "Well, I can't tell them because I'm small and I'm subservient." That's not what it's going to be. They're going to tell you. And when they do tell you, how do you react? Please don't be defensive. You triggered someone. You insulted someone. Just own it and empathize where they're coming from. Apologize and move on.
I really like that. That makes sense. You talked about it, like address the issue, fix it, and then let's move on, and understand from it. So yeah, that's makes sense. So now, what are the main barriers to equity you observe in education systems today?
Teachers. Teachers are the only professionals that choose who they do the work for. Pause is there on purpose. Like, so if I am a firefighter and there's a fire, I don't look at the ethnicity or ability of that house or the people in the house. I just put out the fire, right? We do know that,
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a bit because often as doctors and lawyers and police people and all of that, we can also show discrimination. But I do know that no matter what, and I worked at high levels of education, no matter what policy, legislation, curriculum, guidance goes down, teaching is the one profession that professional can close their door and they've got 20 to 35 children in that room. And what they do in that room is up to them. There's very few checks and balances that stop a
Mhm.
teacher from discriminating against certain kids. And that could be based on poverty. That could be based on learning ability. If people knew the inner workings of teaching, you would know that many teachers want a class list that has no students with disabilities. They want all neurotypical kids so it can be easier on them. A lot of teachers don't flow well with the resource center. They don't flow well with the learning centers. They don't flow well with the outside entities that are there for kids that are in children's hospitals, that are in care, that are coming in and out of the justice system, that have been traumatized. Like, it's compulsory for children in every community to go to school. So if you don't empathize as a teacher, then you end up teaching the curriculum to the best math students and the ones that are most quiet and most, I mean, again, spiritual logic, they come from the most solid homes. But when you have the whole community coming to your school building, due to percentages, you are going to have students that need support. And so it's the attitude of the teacher that is the biggest barrier. Because I will say this to you is that after 30 plus years in education, a good teacher doesn't need someone standing over them with a stick to treat children fairly. And a bad teacher will treat children unfairly with a person standing over them with a stick. It's their attitude. It's their how they see the students. And so one of the things around my approach was my my classroom one was not owned by me. So my students came in and out of the classroom. Whenever someone put their hand up and said, "Sir, can I use the washroom?" I said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa. How old are you? 15, 16? You never have to ask me to go pee. You can go to the washroom. I don't own this classroom. You guys own the classroom. But if you're gone to the washroom for more than the time it takes to pee, I'm calling the hospital because you're hurt. Something's going there's something going on. But if you just like deal with kids where you don't own the classroom and you make it an equitable space and you show each of them that you care. It's empathy. It's different levels of caring. Sometimes someone needs a dime, metaphorically. Sometimes people need quarters. Sometimes people need $20. Sometimes people need $100. You have to give people what they need. And so that's that's spiritual logic. You got to do some self-growth in order for you to show up as a teacher like that. And if you don't do that, then you're the teacher that loves Christmas holidays, you love March break, and you love the 2 months off in the summer, but you don't really love the students that much. And there's hundreds, if not, well, let's just thousands of teachers nationally that are in that boat. They love the flow. They love the middle class poverty that we live in as teachers, but they don't love the students. And so I'm very much a proponent of student-centered learning, right? Like, just like the business community focus on the client, the students are our clients. We're there to serve them. And so I think the biggest barrier is teachers that don't see themselves as servants.
Right. Now, you've served as the executive lead for inclusive education and director of the African Canadian Services Branch. What have you learned about what genuine institutional change looks like?
Well, the best part of that is both those jobs were with the Nova Scotia government. And at the time, I was taking leadership courses, again, to keep growing. And what we started to focus on was change management. And so, from a psychological point of view and a human-centered point of view and a systemic point of view, what does it mean when you bring change to a system, when there's humans in the system? And so what I learned was when you're in the Department of Ed of any province, you're far away from the client, which is the student. Like, you're not in schools anymore. You're not a principal. You're not even admin. Like, you're not even in the building. So positive part is it's usually people with experience that are asked to move to the Department of Education. I get it. But what I I think you still have to remember your time in a school building with colleagues, with administration, with janitorial staff, with students in particular, so that the policies that you're dreaming up are able to be transferred to a real life situation. Let's just say theory and practice. And so what I found is we can often get caught up in the higher levels of education, theorizing about things, right? And the practical part is, how is this going to hit in North Preston? How is this going to hit in Sydney Mines? How is this going to hit in Shelburne? How is this going to hit in downtown Halifax in these schools? And so I think what I learned is that there's got to be a definite synchronicity between and connection between, the higher levels of educational leadership and the leadership on the ground, then the teachers, then the student, and making sure that when these ideas are theorized, that they're tested in real and tested in real life. And I don't think that happens a lot. So from Victoria or from British Columbia to Newfoundland, we have examples of many initiatives and policies and procedures that just didn't work out. And partly it was because in the name of change management, there wasn't that implementation strategy and knowing how humans work with change and being cognitive of that as you're going through the process. So change takes time. Taking the time to change a system, making sure that you're talking to the client about what this change looks like and is that change work for them. All of those things are embedded in what we would call genuine institutional change or authentic institutional change that lasts for 7 generations.
Now, I know you've talked about the word empathy a lot. And, in schools, how can we teach empathy in schools without turning it into just another checkbox?
I think they've got to combine empathy with critical thinking, thinking beyond social media. Like, it's so easy to just scroll and get the surface of everything. So instead of going deep into one thing, you're on the surface of 1,000 things, right? And so I think that you need to connect through spiritual logic that do unto others as you'd have done to yourself. So if you don't want to be bullied, don't bully. If you don't want to be focused on and have things happen to you, which is racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, all of those things happen to marginalized people. So a lot of times the empathy piece has to be with the traditionally neurotypical, well-off kid who lives in a world not at their fault, where they very seldom get negative effects from things. And so to them, empathy is not something they need to have in their life. They still get picked up at school. They still got a lunch. They still got a bank account. All of these things. They've still got a room that has Xbox and a PC and a TV and all these things. So I think it's to try to get the people who have privileges, and trust me, I have privileges. And so it's the people with privileges that need to learn. And I want to stress this, Jared, very, very strongly. It's not up to Black people to fix racism now. It's up to white people to fix it. It's not up to women to face sexualized violence. They can't fix it. Only men can fix it, right? Because the data shows that it's 95% men. So the privileged person, the perpetrator, is the person that needs to have empathy. We often have went through decades of asking the victims to have empathy.
Hmm.
The people that are getting beat down, we're asking them to be empathetic. And how can you take it more? How can you get survival skills? Well, how about if you stop hitting me with that stick, I won't need to survive the stick. And so I think that empathy as a tool, it's very complex because you're sometimes preaching to the converted. There's kids that are forced to be empathetic, right? And then there's other kids that don't need to be empathetic. And so what's great about English language arts is we can use stories, always circling back to the point, we can use stories and characters and conflict as a way to embed students in an empathy conversation. So if you talk To Kill a Mockingbird, which again, people say, oh, the N-word's in it. I love the story. Boo Radley and having empathy for Boo Radley. So Jem and Scout need to have empathy. And then, their dad is the lawyer and he's taking on defending Tom Robinson, who's a Black man who's accused of raping Bob Ewell's daughter when Bob Ewell raped his own daughter. Mm-hmm. Right? And Atticus has to be there to try. So if you read that story with the children, with the students, now we can talk about empathy. So I think it's up to teachers. I think the best place for critical thinking and empathy to be a pool that people dive in, I'd rather them dive into it at school with a teacher with a BED up front who can monitor that. Because our kids go home and are learning about drinking and sex and culture and racism. They're learning from the internet. And we have to be very weary of that because I'm 57 years old. So I grew up in a time of black and white TV, no remote controls, pay phones. There were just so, I mean, Pong was all the thing. Pong. That was holding our attention, was Pong. So I think that right now it is a time where empathy and critical thinking is really something that we take a lot more seriously because our children are in these, what we call the dark web. They're having conversations about sex and violence and racism and homophobia and all these things, and not positive conversations in the dark web. We think about incel and all these things that are going on, involuntary celibate. Like, if that's not an oxymoron, I don't know what is. But I think that all these things exist. And so as parents, if we put our heads in the sand, then our children are learning from a very dangerous space. And so we have to take that space back and make sure that we're really getting them to empathize and think deeply about things rather than surface.
Sense, definitely. I can see, that is work. There's a lot of heavy lifting to do in schools if we are to be able to implement empathy with all teachers to be able to do that. Now, what advice would you give to educators who want to teach anti-racism or inclusion, but are afraid of saying the wrong thing?
Yeah, just wipe your shoes off after you step in the doggy do. Yeah, apologize. Like, this is what I said before. Like, that seems to be, so think about it. In that mentality, you want to be perfect. You're not going to be perfect. You're not. So that thing about saying the wrong thing, like, that cannot be a fear, right? Because if you are teaching and you are open enough to do an Indigenous lesson and you're in Winnipeg and you've got Indigenous students in your class and they correct you, stop, pause. Take the correction. Take the correction from someone who is Indigenous. So, I said the wrong thing. Oh my God, I'm not perfect. No, you're not. If you talk about the diversity within the LGBTQ plus community around those that are trans, the different levels of gender that people identify, it's a complex space. You are going to say things wrong. Also, for those people that don't know, when it comes to being of African descent, we have people from the Caribbean, we have people from Africa, we have people that have been in Canada for 400 years, we have Black Americans. They are not the same. There's similarities, but they're not the same. And so there can't be a fear of saying the wrong thing. How about just do the right thing? So by doing the right thing, you're opening up the curriculum to a space where it hasn't been explored before. And as I say, I think school is that safe space to have certain conversations. And so teachers who are leading the conversation, you don't need to be an expert. And if you're a white teacher, you can never be an expert on Blackness. If you're a settler teacher, you can never be an expert on Indigenous. If you're an able-bodied teacher, you can never be an expert on disabilities. You can't, but you do not need to be to teach, right? So I think there is a thing coming out of BED, and I taught in the School of Education at St. Francis Xavier, and we used to tell students all the time is that you can say to a student, I don't know the answer to that, I'll get back to you. And we have a tradition in teaching where we feel that there's this pressure to know everything and have every answer. It's illogical. It doesn't make sense. And that's not your role in the classroom. The same way basketball coaches, you don't have to know everything. How about this? Parents, you don't have to know everything. You don't. And so I think it's the cult of perfection that leads to writer's block, right? People believe, I think I may make a mistake, so I'm not going to do it. That's almost more problematic.
Now, your energy and how you speak about your work and empathy, how do you sustain your own spirit while leading such emotionally demanding work?
Because, and this isn't only with me, I think when passion, if you look at the etymology of the word, it's an energy, right? And so when you're doing work like this, and as I do this podcast, I don't feel fatigue, right? Like it's energy. And so when you're doing that work that's human, positive, empowering work, it's not a battery thing. It's actually an infinite thing, right? So the soul is infinite. So the dog that you had that got hit by a car that's on the side of the road, and you run to the side of the road and rigor mortis sets in, that's not your dog. Your dog's gone. The dog is the soul, the who you hugged up and loved and licked you and all that. That's an energy, right? And that energy is infinite. because even Einstein would say that energy cannot neither be created nor destroyed. The same energy is on Earth that's been there the whole time. And so the things that are finite are the human body. It's finite. So the energy, I guess what I say is the energy that you use is infinite energy. So as long as I do self-work, so I make sure that I spend time thinking about how I'm treating my wife and my children and my community and my family, and how's my health, and am I eating correctly? Like, there's things you have to do to keep yourself at a base. But people would be surprised, whether you're coaching or teaching or being a parent, how much infinite energy you can tap into if you're doing positive work. Oppositely, they can see how tired they get from negativity. Watch anyone that's in a long, like, hard going argument with someone, and they're even on the internet. Yeah. By the time they get off, they're exhausted, right? Because negative energy is just the same as what I liked about mathematics. The minus sign, negative, is to take away. It will deplete. Even in math, 3 minus 2 equals 1. But the plus sign is what we're engaged in now, is empathy, conversations around change, conversations around improvement and growth. That's a plus sign. So that plus sign will always leave you energized. And then when you're not doing a podcast or whatever, you're not teaching, you're not coaching, you do have things to do in private to keep that baseline. But generally, if you're doing things that are making life better for other human beings, you'll tap into infinite energy.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's a good way to look at it, the plus sign. Now, let's talk about legacy in leadership. Legacy is a word we often say for the end of a story, but in your life, it feels like a living thing. What does legacy mean to you today as a father, educator, and community leader?
This may not be the answer people expect, but legacy means zero to me. And I'll tell you why. I even saw it from my dad. More people gave my dad his flowers when he was dead. And I mean metaphorical flowers. Oh, he was my favorite guy. What a great guy. All that stuff happened when he was dead. When he was alive, whether it was through envy, jealousy, competition, whatever it is, crabs in a bucket, whatever you want to use, there was a lot of people that did not like my dad after he passed. So that legacy is a very slippery slope. Yeah, because you always leave a legacy when you're dead, and it's a lot easier to celebrate someone when they're dead. And so to me, I don't know what my legacy is going to be. I don't even care. I just know that in the now, in a very Buddhist way, the past is a figment of my imagination. The future is a figment of my imagination. I'm only in the now. So all I know is this podcast. That's all I know. That's where I'm at. So because I'm in the moment as much as possible, I don't know what legacy is. Because legacies is what people are going to say about me when I'm not around. I have no control over that. Right. So in the now, though, and based on the other question, I can lay my people with positive energy. And when I do that, that has an effect in the now. But also when I see someone again, that positive energy is still there. Same way, negative energy. If I steal $30 from you and you don't see me for 2 years, when you see me after 2 years, you're still mad at me. It's like, so that negative energy will stay. So the same way, I think that's the legacy, you may call it karma, is that when you do give positivity, it usually comes back to you. But legacy is a human who writes the history and who wants to sometimes benefit from writing about the Augy Jones story. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what I do right now while I'm alive, every minute of the day until I go to sleep. And then I die every night and I'm born every morning.
You've mentored countless students and educators. What qualities do you most hope to instill in the next generation? Empathy, of course.
Empathy for sure, but I also think it's mentoring, right? Like, because you can say to someone, I taught you English, you felt good in my classroom, pass that along, right? Like,
Right.
so if I can model human behavior that's energizing and empowering, my hope is that who feels it knows it, right? Which is the saying with empathize others, feel it, know it. So when I have student teachers with me, or I have young coaches around me, basketball coaches, if I have other men around me who are dads, other men around me that are fathers, I hope that the way that I behave is a model of positivity. That's all I can do. And so if you see that as an example of how to move, the good thing about what you think you might have mentored someone is they were close enough to you to touch the example. So they can't say they never spent time with Augie Jones. They did. And so hopefully by seeing the way I operate, they can see that they can also operate that way. And I think that's the least I can do.
Now, in what ways has fatherhood changed your view of empathy in education?
It scares me. It scares me because we send our kids off to school for from 8:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon for 13 years, from primary to 12. And we're hoping that the people that they interact with love and care for our children the same way we do at home. And that's not happening. So just from having an experience, so someone that's a mechanic or a doctor or work in a bank, they don't know how schools work. I do know how schools work. So as a father, I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. The school system has been up and down for all 4 of them, right? I mean, my oldest, I have 2 daughters and I have an older son who are finished high school, but they all had various positive, negative experiences in high school. And then I've got a 14-year-old that, is doing well in school academically and everything. He hasn't run into a lot of pitfalls, but he's ran into teachers that see him as his lower self and all these things. I guess I almost feel helpless as a father of what goes on from 8:30 to 3:30. But I would back that up with, and again, a note to all the parents out there is please don't let education only exist in school buildings. I'll repeat that. Please don't let the education of your children to exist only in school buildings. Because where I do feel comfortable as a dad is once my children come home, my kids, I can talk to them and educate them, right? Like, I don't, and you don't need to be a teacher to do that. And I think about when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, many parents knew whether I was a Lebanese parent, whether I was an Arabic parent, whether I was an indigenous parent, they knew that there was some of the key learnings had to be done at home or in community or at Jewish schools or at, like they didn't say, hey, school system, take care of my kid. Well, that's what's going on now. And then we get mad when the public school system doesn't 100% educate our kid. That's a ludicrous ask in the first place. So when your son or daughter comes home at 3:30, you got to ask them what went on in school. What did you learn? But we often blame young people as being stuck to our tablets and to Netflix and our computers and our phones. Let's be honest, adults, so are we. So we're happy sometimes to see our kids glued to the Xbox or to their phone because we're glued to something. And we need to unglue ourselves and take our kids out for a walk, talk to them, play board games, do what we might call analog things, not digital things, analog things, beta things, things that don't take electricity, right? If we can do those things, then we also now become an educator in our child's life. It's not just the teachers, because that's a lot of pressure on the teachers and the school system to say, okay, here you go, bring up my kid for me, bring him up. No, man, we have to also be a part of that. So again, my child being in school, my children being in school, I don't trust the school system. But with that distrust means I have work to do when they get home.
Now, if your parents could sit with you now and see your work, what do you imagine they would say?
Well, they would be proud, I guess. I think Khalil Gibran in the poem The Prophet, he talks about God loves the bow as much as the arrow. And if you think about it, like parents are that bow, because I put all kinds of tension on my parents. And so that tension allows the arrow to go further. And so I think they would be very proud of where I'm at around their teachings. My mom taught me to be domesticated. I can wash dishes, fold clothes, iron, sweep, clean, to like with the best of them. And if she saw my house now, she would be very proud of, oh, he does, I can cook, I can clean, I can, now. When I was a teenager, I was mad that I had to do all these things. But now that I'm 57 years old, I think she would be proud of that. And I think even in the conversation that I'm having with you, if my dad was sitting in this room now and he's passed and so is my mom, or they saw a recording of it, I think my dad would be very proud of where I took some of his concepts and brought them, as the arrow did in the prophet, brought them to another level.
What does leadership mean to you now compared to when you first started teaching?
Leadership is the worst job in the room. You're not running for president student council junior high. Like I find leaders now consider, well, hierarchically, I've got a title and I'm at the top. And so, no, it means that the more money you make, the more complex and the more difficult your job should be. So hiring and firing, dealing with HR problems, dealing with the top person should take responsibility for that. And ironically, I find many leaders now who call themselves leaders from a on paper point of view, whether you're a coach or an executive leader or a politician, they're not leading because the tough shit that they have to do, they avoid. And they end up handing it down to people that report to them. And so it's same as being a parent. Ultimately, as a parent, the buck stops with you. So there's things that you have to do because you're the leader in the house. So leader does not mean popularity. Leader does not mean any type of now I get to lay back because I'm a leader. It's actually the exact opposite. The more you take leadership roles, the more you got to do. The more responsibility you have, the tougher your decisions are, the more staff that come up underneath of you that you're responsible for. All of that is as you become a better leader, whether it's in organizations, government, schools, anything that has a hierarchy, you are a leader by definition when you're moving up. But the more you move up, so the higher the monkey climbs a tree, the more you can see its ass.
Yeah, that's a classic. So how do you maintain then your values while working within a large institution?
Everything starts with yourself. I think that institutions come and go. I've had many jobs that I've been in and out of, and it's not really about the job. It's about how I show up to work. So in the Buddhist proverb of the pond and the ripples, so the pond is like glass. There's nothing. It's just there. And when you drop a pebble into it, that first drop is you. And then the next ripple out is the person you wake up to in the morning, your significant other, and then your children, and then your family, and then your community. Well, your job is like 5, 6 ripples out. It's not that important. I say all the time in my facilitations, you are not your job. There's people that honestly believe they are the title, that's just a job. You're not your job. So because I'm not my job, I don't go into any of these spaces as executive leader, inclusive ed, or director of African Indian Service Branch. I don't do that. I go in as that first pebble. I go in as me.
Mhm.
And the same principles that I had when I was in junior high, that I've grown into through university, that I've grown into from 20 years of teaching, that, a decade and a half of executive leadership, that's my pebble. So I now have a way of being that is a leadership way of being that I take that toolkit with me everywhere I go and I take it every day. And so that means I don't get caught up in the fifth, sixth ripple because no matter what happens at work, my wife's still way more important to me. My children are way more important to me. My family's way more important to me. My community's way more important to me. There's no job in the world that can get into those first 4 or 5 ripples. It can't go there. So because I have that boundary, I'm able to go in and work and then come home. Now, if I lived in the 1700s and I owned a farm, it'd be a different thing. Work would be different. But since the Industrial Revolution, work is disconnected from my personal self.
I think there's some serious reflection here, in terms of you've presented a lot and a lot to think about. As we close, I want to linger on the word empathy. It feels like both a lesson and a promise. And what does empathy look like in practice, not just in theory, but in your daily life?
Looks like if you had a drone and you're looking over and Augy Jones is walking, and when he's walking by, and we're going to put a symbol where there's a positive symbol above me, the plus sign. And as I walk to my car and I see my neighbor, and then I walk to the grocery store, what you'll see is that the people around me all start to get plus signs, right? And then I come home and I'm with my wife and I'm with my family, and they, whatever their sign was before I got there, they start to get plus signs. And then I go to work and there's plus signs around everywhere I walk around the building. Hey, to the janitor, to my boss, to my admin assistant. No matter where I go from that drone footage, you just see these plus signs spreading out. That's empathy.
Makes sense. So if you could share, or after decades of teaching, coaching, and leading, what continues to surprise you about people?
It surprises me that people think that they are their new self rather than their old self. So I remember being in the Caribbean and a Rastafarian friend of mine said, you just need to take away 2 things for us to go back to the 1800s: gas and electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Repeat that. Gas and electricity. And we're in the old world in communities playing drums and making up, whistles and making up instruments. Like all it takes is those 2 things. If we ever lose gas, your car is worth 0. If you ever lose electricity, there's no internet. So what do you do? So what I am is I'm my old world self. I live with the concept that being human is not a digital experience. Because even all the AI and everything we talk about, all you have to do is unplug that shit and it's done. If there's no electricity, there's no AI. If there's no electricity, there's no phones. There's no e-commerce. There's nothing. If that's the case, we got to go back to that bank book that the teller used to write in on August 1st. Augie took out $20 and gave me my book back. Right? Like, and so again, what is, that's not a major difference. And when we see storms and hurricanes right now, most of Jamaica is back in the 1800s. It's a sad reality, but Hurricane Melissa did that, right? So when you don't have gas and you don't have electricity, so I'm not becoming a new self that is based on petroleum and electricity. I'm my old self that can exist without those things. And because I exist for the human experience.
Now, if you could share one message with listeners about what it means to empathize with others, what would it be?
You don't know everything, and you don't need to be perfect. Those two things coming together will lead you to humility and empathy. You don't know everything, and you're not perfect. And so when I hear the right fight against the left, it's interesting because Obama is not a saint, and Trump is not the devil. It's somewhere in between.
Right.
So when you're arguing from a right-wing point of view and you're blindly following someone, we often attribute that to Trump followers. But Obama has followers that are blind too, right? So it's not, so it is about that, you know, we don't know everything and we are imperfect. So if that's the state that you live in mentally, then that means I have to listen to people. I have to learn from people. I have to be open to people. I have to accept difference. Why? Because I'm not perfect and I don't know everything. Once you think you're perfect and once you think you know everything, that's when you start putting up boundaries and stop listening to people. That's when you pick and choose who's worthy of your time. That's when you start to put a hierarchy of the value of people. This person's not worth listening to, but this person is. That's when you think you know everything. That's when you think that you are perfect and you are a polished unit right now and you don't need to. No, listen, man, when we are born, we're born naked and alone and we're going to die naked and alone. And I know that sounds dark, but it's true. So all you have in between is learning and growth. That's it. And learning and growth comes from empathy and humility. Because the last thing I'd end off on, Gerard, and thank you so much for the interview, is that I almost feel guilty sometimes for how much I gain from being empathetic. I learn from people every day because I'm listening, right? So I continue to grow and learn and learn new things and possibilities. And wow, recently my wife and I went to Europe. There's things that went on in Europe. We were in Greece, like that blew my mind. Simple things, but I was in a learner stage. So now I come back to Canada with an even open mind because I feel like I'm just here to learn. So empathy means that even if you are the CEO of a company, you don't know everything. If you're the principal of a school, you don't know everything. If you're a politician for an area, you don't know everything. If you are a president, prime minister, I don't care who you are, you don't know everything. You need to rely on other human beings to support you, to live, to learn. And so that's where empathize others comes from, is that we have to exist in a world where we're open to learning from other people.
This is Quiet Land. We meet those who remind us that empathy is not weakness. It is emotion, a rhythm, and a strength. Thank you, Augie Jones, for showing us that leadership begins in the heart, grows through action, and echoes through generations. You've been listening to Across This Quiet Land. If this conversation moved you, share it forward. Until next time, this has been Gerard Damon. Keep listening for the quiet voices that change everything. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Augie.
Thank you, sir.